Hello, I'm Meri Fatin and welcome to Cover to Cover. The program is presented by Writing WA, the peak body for writing and related activities in Western Australia. On Cover to Cover, I meet up with the author of Writing WA's Book of the Month. Today my guest is journalist, academic and author Liz Byrski, whose book In Love and War, Nursing Heroes intertwines her personal experience with the fascinating story of the badly burned airmen in World War II who were the guinea pigs, the renowned plastic surgeon Sir Archibald McIndoe who made their lives livable, and for the first time, an insight into the experience of the nurses who cared for them. Liz, thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you, Meri. It's great to be here.
Sir Archibald McIndoe, a New Zealand-born surgeon who was lured to the US on a prestigious fellowship with his wife and then lured again to London. What kind of a person was he? Tell us about Sir Archibald.
There are different views as to what sort of a person he was, but the overwhelming view is that he was a pretty difficult person, but that he was also an extraordinary surgeon and a genius. His whole trip to England was really his own strength of mind in trying to create something that he had been told into something real. When he was working at the Mayo Clinic in America, an English surgeon, Lloyd Moynihan, came to see him operate at the Mayo, and he said, "We could do with a young chap like you, great surgeon." He was very impressed with him. "You should come to England. We need people with your sort of talent, and I'm building a hospital and you should come and work there." On the basis of that, McIndoe chucked up his new life in America with his wife and went to England. He never bothered to follow up on whether or not there was a job. He gave up this prestigious fellowship in the US and landed in England in winter, cold, dark, everywhere very depressed and miserable, early 30s. And when he got there, he found that Moynihan didn't have a hospital. It was a dream, and a dream that I believe never came true. So there was no job. But both his biographers suggest that single-mindedness with which he pursued that, deliberately not finding out whether it existed or not, but wanting to go to London, was the same sort of single-mindedness that made him such an extraordinary, talented surgeon.
So how did he end up then from arriving in London to no job and no hospital at the Queen Victoria Hospital in East Grinstead, Sussex?
Well, he started off, he got a job at the School of Tropical Medicine in London and another sort of part-time employment at St Thomas's Hospital. But his cousin, Sir Harold Gillies, was a plastic surgeon. He had done a lot of work on repairing injuries to soldiers and from the First World War. He'd set up a treatment centre in Sidcup in Kent, and he had actually done some facial reconstruction surgery and was also working on how you could keep people alive when they'd been very badly burned and how you could repair their faces. So skin grafts, and what they were trying to do then was flesh grafts. And he was McIndoe's cousin, so he said, "Well, come and work with us." And plastic surgery then, it was seen as the thing of the future, both for cosmetic purposes and for the healing of dreadful war wounds. And so the two worked together with two other plastic surgeons. And then at the beginning of the war, when the RAF was preparing its hospitals to deal with the effects of what was going to be a new sort of war in the air, some hospitals were allocated to treat those injuries around the country. And the four plastic surgeons in the Gillies practice, McIndoe and Gillies and two others, they were the only plastic surgeons in England at the time. And each one was allocated to an RAF hospital. And he was allocated to a hospital at East Grinstead in Sussex. It was a cottage hospital that was a normal small town hospital, but they put in a burns ward, which was a converted army hut, and that was McIndoe's ward, but he was also the superintendent of the hospital.
So Ward 3 was his domain, essentially, yes. And he ran it very unconventionally. But as you said, I mean, his surgical techniques were pioneering. He was knighted for those surgical techniques. Did he become in that place like a god figure?
He did, and his patients called him God. You know, when you talk to those men, you can understand why, because the injuries that they had were, in the first place, injuries that in the previous war they would have died from. So what had happened between the wars was that they had managed to discover how to keep men alive when they were very badly burned, and it involved restoring the chemical balance of the body. So they were alive, the patients were alive, that was the first thing. But the second thing was that he pioneered techniques that actually made life livable for them again. So they were developing new techniques in grafting flesh as well as grafting skin. And he developed all sorts of different treatments to make the process less agonizing and more effective. But he also had this very authoritarian manner, which gave him a godlike status, and the men loved him. They adored him because he made them feel that there was hope. And he did operate on them in ways that actually began to restore their function, to make them able to work and to make them go out into the world. So a lot of his patients called him God, or the boss, or just Archie.
And it was a huge responsibility. I mean, I always think there's a connection there with surgeons having that great sort of ego, is in relation to the responsibility that they have for taking care, and in his case for many men who absolutely relied on his skill. And I want to read this quote. This is from later in life, that he said to his friend Angela Fox, "When I looked at a burned boy for the first time and saw that I must replace his eyelids, God came down on my right arm."
Yeah.
Gives me shivers, absolutely.
Yes. And he did, I mean, he did things that had not been done before. And he would look at a man with fingers that were burned to absolute stumps, little stumps, and he found ways of cutting in between the knuckles so that they could actually get some grip and perhaps hold a knife and fork. I mean, one of his patients, Alan Morgan, was a toolmaker. And working on very fine jig boring, and he ended up with no fingers. And eventually, after several operations, Macindoe had him in a state where he could actually go back and do his job as a jig borer, although he did actually have to keep his hands in his pockets when he went to the interview, so that the boss couldn't see them, because he'd had other interviews where they wouldn't take him because they saw his hands. So he kept his hands in his pockets and got the job. And then the boss came along one day and said, "You didn't tell me about your hands." And he said, "Well, am I doing the job okay?" And of course he was.
Yeah. You've alluded to some of the injuries, but I wanted to get a clearer picture of why the men were injured in the way that they were, and what the breadth of injuries were that Macindoe was dealing with all the time.
Well, for the fighter pilots, with, for example, a Spitfire, the fuel tank is located just in front and underneath where the pilot is sitting. So the fuel tank is hit, it goes up immediately, and the fire sweeps right up the front of the body. And so it is hands, face, head, ears, those parts of the body that are first and worst when it comes to burns. And they were supposed to wear their flying helmets and goggles and gauntlets and leather jackets. But the cockpit of the fighter aircraft is a very confined space, and most of them didn't feel that they could handle the aircraft effectively, deal with the small controls, get a grip on the steering wheel. I don't even know it's just called a steering wheel in an aeroplane, I think it is, but couldn't get a grip on that, and the instruments, and often couldn't get their arms up to open the hatch if they needed to get out. So they all took off those things. So they were completely unprotected, most of them. And that's why the worst injuries that they were dealing with the fighter pilots were facial. You know, noses had gone, chins had gone, flesh on cheeks had gone, terrible scarring. In some cases, all the nerves in the face were destroyed. Fingers, hands gone, hands completely gone, or fingers, ears, those sorts of injuries. And then for the Bomber Command crew, there were more diverse injuries, a lot of burns, but also more breakages, so broken noses, chin bones going up through the roof of the mouth, that sort of thing, as well as the burns, because they would come perhaps when an oxygen tank exploded in the aircraft if it was hit.
And then, of course, at the time, the thinking was that the best way of dealing with it was to apply tannic acid.
Yes, tannic acid was, and some people might remember too, gentian violet, which was a similar thing. It was a product that you put onto a burn or or a wound to cover it completely, keep out infection. So it was very useful in combat to have tannic acid with you because it was in a tube, and it was really handy, and it could be spread over the area, and it would form a crust over it, so that it would be a smooth crust and it would keep out any infection. Faces, eyelids, everywhere. And in many ways it was effective because it did reduce infection, unless of course there was dirt or hair or something underneath it. But the awful thing for the men with the burns was that when it had to be taken off in order to treat them. So when they would get to hospital, this hard shell would have to be chipped off their wounds a bit at a time. And they tell you that that was far more painful than the burns themselves. And Macindoe saw that, and he saw also that the men who came down in the sea fared better than those who came down on land. And he assumed this was due to the salt water. And so he tried treating them with saline baths. And so they would be given 2 or 3 blood temperature baths in warm salt water a day to soften up a bit the tannic acid and to have it removed while they were in the bath. But then also, after that was done, to keep them going in and out of the water, to keep their limbs and their wounds mobile. And instead of having those hard fixed dressings, then he developed soft gauze dressings coated with substances like Vaseline to keep the wounds soft and moist and able to heal. Those treatments are still being used today.
By the end of World War II, the Guinea Pig Club had 649 members.
Yes.
And so how did you qualify as a guinea pig?
You qualified as a guinea pig by being mashed, boiled or fried by the war in the air and being treated at East Grinstead. So obviously they weren't the only burns patients who were treated with plastic surgery, but they were the ones that were treated in Macindoe's Ward 3 at East Grinstead.
I want to tie in now your personal connection to East Grinstead, because the first burns victims arrived in 1939, which is long before you were born. But when you came to East Grinstead, I think your earliest memory was around the age of 6.
I've got a few memories from before that, but I can really pin it to the age of 6, and that was 1950. And by then I was accustomed to being frightened of seeing these terribly injured men all around the town. They were, because they had so many operations, some of them had 50, 60 operations. In between those operations, they could be up and about, and they used to walk into town or ride a bike into town or drive into town, and they were all over the place. And I was very frightened of them. I was terrified of them.
But your natural reaction had to be suppressed, because Macindoe asked more of the residents of East Grinstead to be kind and welcoming, to be normal. In fact, there was a story written that called East Grinstead the town that doesn't stare.
That's right.
Were all the children scared?
No, they weren't. I have a close friend, a couple of close friends who I've talked to about this, and others as well. And one of them, his uncle was a guinea pig, so he understood what was happening. The other was my close childhood friend at the time. And when I talked to her about it as an adult and how frightened I was, she said she wasn't frightened. She'd been told, that all about it. Her parents had told her all about it. I think I'm sure there were others that were scared, but I didn't find any. I think I was terrified because my parents would never talk about the war. It was like, you know, don't talk about the war. And if it was mentioned, they would give me sideways glances to make sure that I was all right and not being frightened by it, you see. And yet, the town was full of these men from the war. There was also a war going on in Korea at that time too. So I had this all muddled up in my head. There was a war, there is a war, these men are from the war, and the war that was going on was a different war. My mother told me, no, they're from the other war, you know, World War II, it's all over now, don't worry about it. The other war in Korea, I actually thought Korea was on the south coast of England. So I thought it was really, really close, you see. And none of this was ever explained to me. And so I think that's where my fear came from.
And also the fact that East Grinstead was bombed.
It was, yes.
So you had every reason, which you would have been aware of that.
I think I knew about it at the time, but I don't know. I wasn't there at the time. That was 1943, I think. Yeah.
When you returned to East Grinstead in 2007 on a research mission for this book, did you understand how difficult it would be to extract the stories from the guinea pigs and for the first time from the nurses? Had you an inkling of what that might be like?
No, I honestly went feeling extremely confident, foolishly confident, I think. I thought I'd done, interviewed people on radio and on TV and for newspapers and so on for years and taken on some difficult interviews. And I'd seen some of these guys on documentaries and they all seemed happy to talk about how it was. And I thought, I'll just pick a few and I'm sure it'll be fine. And in fact, it was fine, to the point that I realised that they were all telling me exactly the same story in the same way, and that I couldn't get any deeper, and that every time I tried to get deeper, I tried to talk to them about fear, how they felt, how frightened they were, how it felt, that I was always deflected, and usually deflected with humour. And that was when I got really stuck and thought, that I'm doing something wrong. I just can't get any further with them. It took me a long time to work out that was because they had found a way of telling their story, a way that was acceptable to them, a way that made it possible for them to talk about what had happened to them. And I mean, I should have known this. We know about post-traumatic stress now, but because I'd seen them performing, I assumed they could also go further.
Well, you gave it a term. You called it memorialisation.
Yes.
So by that you mean that it was just the bit that they were prepared to tell. Perhaps the details of the other stuff had faded with time, possibly?
Possibly, but I think Mackinder told them they were heroes. He told the town that they were heroes, and many of them were. But he said it to all of them, even those who were injured when they were on leave. But he told them they were heroes, and they came to believe they were heroes, and this was the story. And the ward, of course, has been memorialised. Their stories have been told over the years. Richard Hillary's book, The Last Enemy, which many people would have read, people of my age, particularly boys of my age, would have read at school, though this all created a memorialisation of the guinea pig experience, and they had found ways of talking about it in that way, and that, I believe, forms a crust, just like the tannic acid over the wound. You can't see the other worse, awful, really dreadful stuff that's going on underneath for them and for the people around them.
I want to go back to talking about Ward 3 and about how it was run unconventionally. Can you paint a picture of what it was like?
Well, the first time that, just before the war started, the first time that Mackinder went to look at the hospital and the ward that he'd got, he was horrified at how limited the facilities were and how small it was. And he also insisted that it was repainted. Instead of the awful cream and brown standard issue paint, it was painted in nice colours. He wanted flowers in the ward. He wanted some informal furniture in there, some armchairs and things like that. But when the men started to come in, he wanted to make it even more homely, and so he had a gramophone in there, a radio, so there was music in the ward all the time. There was a barrel of beer, which the men could help themselves to as well. And there was a very casual attitude towards procedures that in other hospitals were governed by rigid rules. So he had a friendly, homely-ish environment in the ward, and he wanted an informal relationship between not only himself and his patients, but also his staff, so the anaesthetist and the other surgeons that he had around him, and eventually the nurses.
So it was unconventional in the way that the nurses were expected to interact with the patients as well, and they played tricks on the nurses.
They did, yes. What McIndoe did was to dissolve all the boundaries that related to the professions of nursing and medicine and patients. So where there was always distance and formality between the patients and the surgeon, or the nurses and their patients, he dissolved all those. He said, we're all in this together and we've all got to get on. And the patients called him by his Christian name, which was unheard of in those days. The thing for the nurses was that it was a time when they were trying to establish the profession as a profession, and part of their training, a big and important part of their training, was that you didn't get friendly with the patients, you kept your distance, you didn't get emotionally involved. And so this came as a terrific shock to the nurses.
And that was the ones who managed to get in, because the rules for applying were pretty stringent too. Not only did you have to be tough and capable, you had to be rather attractive.
Well, you had to be rather attractive, and McIndoe's daughter told me that they were his priorities. First, they had to be great nurses. Second, they had to be good looking, and they also had to be the sort of women who wouldn't mind having their bottoms pinched. And that's what he was aiming for. And their most strict instruction when they started was that if they were ever seen being repelled, with a look on their face that showed that they were repelled by the sight of these men's faces or hands, or that they were frightened or disgusted or anything like that, they were out, they were gone straight away, because he wanted the nurses to make the men feel good about themselves, not just to nurse them, but to make them feel good about themselves. So we have a ward of young men who have no restrictions actually on their behaviour in the ward. Lots of jokes, they'd ride bikes into the ward, they'd bring all sorts of other things into the ward, they'd throw things around. They would actually move the beds around sometimes, because many of the patients were heavily bandaged. So the others would move the beds around, so the nurses didn't know who they were treating. And they would pinch their bottoms and try to cuddle them and make sexy remarks to them, and really treat them as though they were their girlfriends. So you had this ward full of men who were behaving really like naughty schoolboys, and no controls, because they couldn't report it, because even if they reported it to matron would take it to McIndoe, and he would say, well, these women just have to put up with it.
Yeah, and this is a really important part of In Love and War, is that for the first time you sought to hear the stories from the nurses, that it was actually very important to understand how they were really affected by this experience. So how did you go when you started speaking directly to the nurses? Well,
it wasn't quite as easy as I thought it was going to be. I thought, I'll find some nurses. And so I went and looked in archives at the Royal College of Nursing and the Imperial War Museum and various other places, trying to find nurses, because I couldn't get any contacts from the men themselves. They'd all kept in touch. They had a network, but most of them had not any contact with nurses, or the nurses had died or they lost contact. And so I was starting with absolutely nothing to find the nurses. And eventually I did get a referral from someone who worked at the Imperial War Museum, who told me how to contact one called Lady Moira Nelson, who had nursed there at the end of the war. And slowly and bit by bit, I managed to get contacts from various people in the most surprising way. My friend who had been a child in East Grinstead at the same time as me was talking to someone at a local business function, and he said his sister had been a nurse, and so I got her. But it was really difficult. I found one guinea pig actually in a similarly difficult way too, by talking to somebody on a railway station. But with the nurses it was hard, and there was really very little to go on, because the story was that we all had a wonderful time, that the nurses loved this environment. And I kept thinking, I wonder if they really did, because it sounds a pretty unpleasant environment to have to go to work in. Would have been for me. And you know, when I was that age, it was the early 60s. So I kept thinking that there must be another side to this story. I even got reduced to standing on street corners in East Grinstead, accosting old people and asking them if they had lived there during the war, and if so, did they know any nurses. And slowly, bit by bit, I would get a referral to one, and then she'd give me a number for another one, and so on. But it certainly wasn't easy.
And then also the stories that they were telling you didn't all line up to be the same version of events even, did they? I mean, some nurses actually did quite enjoy the experience, and others found it difficult to bring themselves to tell you honestly that it was actually really rough.
Yes. Well, some of them, the more confident women, the young women who had perhaps been middle or upper class girls who had better education and were a bit more worldly, they coped with it better. Not all of them, but the tendency was for those to be the more confident women to be able to handle it better. But some of the other girls, especially the voluntary aid detachment nurses, so these are many of them in their late teens or early 20s, not fully trained nurses, just given 3 months fairly inadequate Red Cross training before going straight into a hospital ward. They were the ones who found it very difficult. They were shy, some of them never been out with a boy, they lived very narrow lives in poor conditions, and they thought this was going to be an amazing adventure, and they found instead that they were extremely intimidated and frightened by this environment in which they had no control over what would happen and no point of recourse. And many of them had never felt so bad about it, felt shamed by this taunting and teasing and this sort of coercion into having sex, or at least, you know, the preliminaries to having sex, that they'd never told anyone about it. And that they certainly didn't want to talk about it in the town, because in the town, the patients and Mackendorf himself were so much loved and respected. And a couple of them told me, well, I would never have told my mother or my parents, because they would have thought it was my fault, that, you know, they would only behave like this to me if I was doing something wrong, if I was leading them on.
Because they're heroes.
Because they're heroes.
It was a world of paradox, and I love the fact that you are part of this story personally, because it allows a kind of an insight into your understanding and the real subtleties of the story. For example, a lot of the women painted the picture that they were doing important war work, and that was what they had to do for the war. And I think you personally struggled with that. But then on the other hand, there was also the fact that the blokes had done something that was pretty extraordinary too, or they'd gone through something quite different, but yet something that most humans shouldn't be asked to do. But how did you personally wrestle with this? Because you probably you had an idea of how you thought it must have been for them, but they weren't always telling you that story. It
was hard. I nearly backed off from the nurses' stories. I had a really wobbly period in the middle of the time that I was there, and I thought, this is too hard. These women haven't talked about this before. Who am I to do this? messing with a legend here, messing with stories of heroism by making public this other aspect of it. But at the same time, I did feel that those stories should be told, because there are so many stories of women that emerge from conflicts around the world and over centuries that have never been told. And a couple of the women I spoke to said, "Oh, well, I don't mind, I'll talk to you about it, but don't write it. And
all wanted to change their names.
Well, most of them wanted to change their names, yes, because they didn't want it to reflect badly on the men, because they loved them. They became very close to them. However they felt about all this stuff, they became very close to them because it was an extremely intimate relationship, the way they had to deal with them.
Yes.
And they thought they were heroes, they believed they were heroes, and they were fond of them. Many of them just hated the behaviour. And they did. The way they rationalised putting up with it was to say, well, you did your bit for the war, we all had to do our bit for the war, and this wasn't as bad as some other people had to do. And of course the men, they were young, it wasn't like old men and young women.
Yeah.
It was, they were roughly the same age. Some of the nurses were older and married. It was very difficult for them. They were worried about what their husbands might have thought. But you can see, it's easy to have a 21st century feminist position on this as absolutely entirely inappropriate and wrong and should not have happened. But at the same time, it saved those men's lives. The surgery kept them alive, but it was this environment with the women and with other staff in the hospital and so on that actually made them feel that they could have a life again. Because they were so hideously disfigured, many were abandoned by wives or girlfriends that they'd had before the war. They'd take a look at the injuries and they couldn't cope with that. So it gave them the will to live. Macindoe created an environment which, while we now think this is sort of behaviour is unacceptable, but it kept them alive.
Yes.
And it gave them the will to live. It restored their sense of themselves as being lovable.
And you describe each thread of this story as being a loss of innocence, which I think is a great way of us understanding that there were no rights and wrongs, really. It was just muddling through, in a sense, as best they could, to, I guess, largely an outstanding outcome.
Oh, an extraordinary outcome, yes. He created a therapeutic community in the hospital first and then in the town, I think for the first ever time. He also facilitated the formation of the first ever real patient support, mutual support group. But the whole town came to the party. The whole town was told, don't laugh at these young men, welcome them into your homes, don't point at them, don't stare at them, don't let your children laugh or throw stones. Because people in the First World War and in the early part of the Second World War were not accustomed to facial disability because people were shut away, facial disfigurement,
yes.
sorry. People were shut away because they were too hideous to look at. But he made it possible for them to go out on the streets in that town, and the people didn't stare. He held public meetings. He said, welcome them into your homes, make them feel at home, don't isolate them, don't marginalise them. And the people accepted them, and they did invite them into their homes, and they had cricket matches for them and darts matches and musical evenings and all those sorts of things. So they were very safe there.
The way that you've pieced this story together was really quite a labour of love. It was almost like your own piece of plastic surgery in the end, wasn't it? Because when you came back from East Grinstead, it was literally years before the book finally came to fruition. What happened in that space that made it so difficult to pull this story together?
It took a long time because I couldn't work out how to write it, whether I should include the personal story and how I would bring the stories together. So there was that decision, but there were also things holding me back all the time, which I didn't really understand. But there was also work. other work and other books that I was committed to writing, I also wasn't sure what it was that I was supposed to learn from writing that book. And that's where we come to what I learned about the war and about innocence and how war can affect you even if you are only a baby when you're born into it.
Yeah. And then, having read the book, I understood the double meaning of the title in Love and War, Nursing Heroes. Was it nursing heroes or was it nursing heroes?
It's both.
Yeah. Now, we always ask for a recommendation for a West Australian book, and you've brought Lena Gaunt.
Yes, I have. The Life and Loves of Lena Gaunt by Tracy Farr. It's published by Fremantle Press, and Tracy Farr is a West Australian author, although she now lives in New Zealand. And I absolutely love this book. It's a story of a woman's life told in the first person, from childhood through until she's in her 80s, and she was the first woman to play the theremin, which is electronic music back in the 20s, 30s, and she's had a fascinating life in Australia, part of the time living in Cottesloe, in a building that people who know Cottesloe will remember. What really captivated me in this book is the voice of Lena, which Tracy Farr has created and captured so beautifully, even in childhood through to a woman in her 80s. And she's such a feisty, humorous character. I absolutely loved it. I bought it for all my women friends.
The Life and Loves of Lena Gaunt by Tracy Farr. I can't wait to read it. Liz, reading in Love and War, Nursing Heroes, has been such an enriching experience for me, and I'm so glad that you finally found a way through. Thanks so much for being with me on Cover to Cover.
Thank you, Meri.
If you have an upcoming publication, we'd love to hear about it so we can spread the word in our Love to Read local e-newsletter. Click on the Submit a Post link on our website to send the information. Our Proximity WA website has an events calendar to help readers and writers in regional areas find literary events nearby, and you can use this to promote events you're organising as well. Feedback is really valuable, so we know we're reaching our audience and covering topics that interest you. Please contact us with your thoughts and suggestions on how we can improve Cover to Cover. We'd really appreciate hearing from you. Next month on Cover to Cover, I'll meet writer, education consultant and current State Library of Western Australia Batty Fellow, Ian Reid. We'll discuss his third novel, The Mind's Own Place, which blends imaginary characters and episodes with a factual framework of Western Australia's early settler history. Thanks for joining me. Enjoy reading local and see you next month. And thank you, Liz.
Thank you, Meri.